Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Scott Butcher, and welcome to the third and final webinar in the Introduction to an Effective Earned Value Management System series. Let me get going with the actual webinar itself. So as I say, welcome to the third and final installment of Introduction to an Effective Earned Value Management System. So today we're going to cover how to assure yourself that you have a credible earned value management system and a credible baseline for your project. And how you can maintain this assurance and credibility throughout the scope of your project. Like we did last time, with your blessing, I won't introduce myself or Martin. If you haven't heard us speak before, the first two webinars are available on YouTube, and on the first one, Martin and I gave a more detailed introduction of our experiences and why we're giving these webinars. But today is a bit of a packed agenda, and if I can move on, I will. So why these webinars? You've heard me talk about this before. Largely, I have a personal belief that while we do earned value analysis quite well, I think very few people understand what the system is that underpins good earned value analysis. So Martin and I have taken it on board to try and spread the good word of what makes a good EVMS. And if you remember, going back to the first three webinars, in the first webinar, we did a bit of myth busting. We told you what is and what isn't involved in earned value. We compared an earned value management system with a traditional, what you might regard as project control system. And one of the warnings we gave was that, well, there was two warnings really. One was that earned value management isn't this magic solution that will fix all of your problems, but also a full-blown, for want of a better phrase, earned value management system is incredibly difficult, incredibly onerous, and shouldn't be. I'm not saying you should avoid it, but you should only do it if you're contracted to, because it is something very, very specific. We also talked about in that first webinar the importance of a good performance measurement baseline. In the second webinar, Martin and I then went on to go into more detail about what constitutes a good earned value management system. We used initially the 32 criteria you would expect to see in AEIA 748, the US standard for earned value, but we noted that was too complex. We showed a page of one of the 32 criteria explaining what you might have to do to meet that one criteria. So we then broke it down into a more traditional project control cycle and walked you through what constitutes an earned value management system. Martin then gave us some really interesting insight into where earned value management is useful and where it's not so useful, and therefore how you may wish to tailor your earned value management system to meet the needs of your specific project or scope of work. In today's webinar, having set up your EVMS, you now need to assure yourself that you have a good system in place. You need to assure yourself that your baseline is valid, and you need to keep doing that throughout the scope of your project. And this is what Martin and I want to talk to you about today, how you provide that assurance to both yourself as the project manager and to your customer, so they are assured that they will get their product or their outputs on time and on budget. So let's launch straight in. Martin and I are going to talk to you today about 4 basic reviews, but what I want to do first is talk to you about how these reviews fit together and why we do them in a certain order. So what we've got here in this slide is a system of review. The green boxes represent the 4 standard review cycles we would expect to see to establish earned value management in your organization and in your project. So let's just start at the top blue box, however. You need at some point an earned value management description, system description. You need to actually describe what you're going to do. Having got that in an organization, you conduct a system demonstration review, and Martin will talk to you about this in a few minutes. That is normally done organizational wide and done once. So an organization, let's say a particular site of a large organization or organization itself, will assure themselves that they have all the processes and systems in place to conduct good earned value management. You then validate that, and that's the blue box in the middle. When a project starts, you then need to validate the way you are deploying your own value management system on your project itself. And that is done by something called the integrated baseline review, which once again is normally done once near the start of a project. Having got your project underway, you would be expected to do ongoing reviews to provide that continuous assurance that you are working to the system. They are done by something called surveillance reviews that I will talk to you about, and an annual EAC review that Martin will talk to you about. And together, this cycle of reviews provides that assurance that you have a valid and working system, and you are actually deploying that system in the way it was intended. I'm now going to hand over to Martin, who's going to talk to you about the system demonstration review, the first step in that map I just showed you.
Before I get into the SDR itself, the system demonstration review itself, one quick thing to point out: each of these reviews, both Scott and I will talk to these in terms of where the review resides in the model, and Scott's already alluded to that circular methodology. We will talk to its purpose, its focus, and also the process that you will follow in enabling, enacting, and also closing out these reviews as we go through. But first up is the system demonstration review. It's important to note, irrespective of aiming for either an earned value management system or perhaps a somewhat lesser project control system, the processes contained within and the training material provided, and of course the tool sets used, all of those things must provide a seamless capability to meet the project and the customer needs. Therefore, once a system, Scott alluded to the system description, and that is all about people, process, data, tools, what you do, who does it, the interactions required. Once that system has been written and has been trained, it has to show its capability and its compliance through example. Typically, that's a pilot project that will be selected, where the capability can be demonstrated through a number of things. That is a review of the process itself in major piece parts, interviews with key personnel, project managers, control account managers, intermediate program managers, finance managers, resource managers, etc. The list is quite long. And also the data, the data that was enabled initially to form the baseline, and the data that is emanated from this pilot project to show how that data has been managed through time. And that will include any baseline change controls. It will include all documentation sets, authorizations. It will also include performance as well as forecasts, and include risks and opportunities. Of course, you're going to need a review team to go through this, and because this is the first of the reviews, then primarily it's going to be program management experts. These people, your PMO, it could be the greybeards that you bring in from outside, external people. These people have to have an explicit expertise in perhaps all of the skills, or certainly some of the skills required within this this system capability that you would have produced. That's not to say that engineering experts won't participate, but they will not be prime in this review. It's very important that you get your program management experts involved in this with engineering support. The process is intentionally intrusive. It's a very important note to be aware of. It will delve into everything. It will check and balance every single thing that your system description says that you do on the tin. But equally important, it's not designed to be critical of any individuals. If you go into review and your first port of call is to critique people, then the review will fail. This is looking at the system. Is it capable of producing what's needed by the project and the customer? It may point to training issues that need to be overcome, but again, it's not to point at individuals. So the purpose, as Scott's already alluded in the model, it's the first port of call. This SDR, the System Demonstration Review, it supersedes all the other reviews. It's the primary assurance vehicle. The SDR focuses on the system stated capability, what you say that you do on the tin, the understanding and the acceptance of necessary standards that you you are obligated to follow, and of course the level of compliance that is being achieved throughout the entire system by everybody involved. And it has to be in that order, because people will comply, but it's very important that the system states what they must do, and there's an acceptance and a complete understanding of the standards by which they have to comply. The review is intended to provide assurance that an organization system, including its people, is fit for purpose, its credibility. It examines the people, process, data, and tools, but it's not solely about the tools. I often use a saying that, you know, a fool with a tool will always be a fool. The tool can only help you along this journey so far, but it needs to be enabled correctly, and of course it needs to be used correctly, and that's where the people, process, and data comes into play, perhaps at least equal, but probably more so than the tool set itself. It's aimed at being a one-time event. These reviews are quite expensive in the way that they need to be prepared for, enacted, and then closed out. So you don't really want to do this any more than you need to. It's aimed, as Scott says, on a site-wide basis, on organization, and certainly not project by project. It can be enacted more than once, but that will be done through a review called a reason called a calls for review. If you went back to Scott's model that he showed, there was one block above the surveillance review that was calls for review, and what that says is that if there are findings within the surveillances that give calls for concern that things are not going as smoothly as they should do, or people are simply not following the guidelines, then in extreme cases a calls for review can be enacted, and it will mean a second system demonstration review, but you won't want to go down that path unless you absolutely have to. The system demonstration review is usually led by an external, suitably qualified, experienced personnel. It's done for a reason, is that they explicitly know the standards by which a system should be written and complied with. It's certainly external to the project people, but usually external to an organization as well. These are truly experts in their field. A couple of quick notes is that if you are contracted to the formal earned value management rules, that's EIA 748 standard, then the SDR will provide explicit validation. It will check every single one of those rules for validation, and may well be contractually obligated thereafter. If, however, you're not required to follow everything that 748 requests, and you are deploying a project control system, then the SDR is still a valid assurance process, but it will be to check against acceptable standards that's acceptable to the project and of course acceptable to the customer. It's this acceptance may be contractually obligated thereafter. Important. An SDR is a pass-fail event. Scott will tell you later the opposite in an IBR. Unless for an extreme reason, an IBR is not a pass-fail. It's reason for change. But an SDR, you have to prove your capability. You have to prove that the system works for everybody and it's understood, trained, and being complied with. So for this one reason, it really is a pass or fail event. It's this review that assures the capability. So what makes up this system capability focus? Well, there are a number of things, as the slide already points to. I'll quickly run through a couple of the key elements in here. I'm certainly not going to go into every single one because, as you can appreciate, each one of these has a number of needs and expectations. But let's take them one by one in some higher level views. Organization. Is there an adequate resource skill base that are trained to provide a seamless capability? Has the organization the ability to construct, manage, and report a product, breakdown structure, a cost breakdown structure, a work breakdown structure, and operating an organizational breakdown structure. Estimate quality. Is there a capability to understand and substantiate time cost baseline in terms of proposal, and thereafter in terms of baseline changes and its forecasting? Is there capability? Does it exist? Is the data going to be proven to be meaningful and accurate at all times? Scheduling is perhaps one of the biggest things that needs to be catered for. In the previous two webinars, we've mentioned integrated master schedules, and we brought up topics around the planning and scheduling excellence guide and the generally accepted scheduling principles. These are the PASEG and the GASP documentation and rules stipulated by the National Defence Industries Association. There has to be an understanding of these needs to enable, use, and maintain an integrated master schedule. Remember what we said in the past: a schedule is not simply tasks in Microsoft Project, in Oracle P6 or whatever tool you tend to use. There has to be a lot more logic applied and reasoning under these PASEG and GASP rules. And again, remember, it's not solely about the tool set. Resourcing. Resourcing must carry the needs for both labor, internal and external, and also material. Most major organizations, they've got an enterprise resource management system, an ERP system in operation, and it will cover the manning machine levels of resources necessary. This demonstration will have to show, as part of your project control system, your earned value management system, how that ERP system interacts with it, such that the estimates, the original baseline, the changes to that baseline will be managed and reported through time. Budgeting and authorization. This really comes down to matching funds versus budget. There has to be an understanding and alignment and reconciliation of these two terms and documented, and this will eventually feed into the authorizations that allows work to begin from the point of baseline. In the middle of this, of course, it includes not just program management or engineering, it includes commercial and finance acceptance of these findings and this level of documentation, as well as the project. Subcontract management. This is really about how are they managed? How do they fit into this system stated capability? There are a number of ways of doing this, and I haven't got the time right now to go into that, but you have to be able to prove how there is credible management, a flow of information, change control within the subcontract work that is being enacted. Cost accounting. It sounds a lot like finance. It's true to say there is a little bit in here, but this is all about the adequacy of cost collection and reporting capability. It also includes the use of estimated actuals. We touched on that topic, I think it was in webinar number 2. Somewhat like accruals, but they are temporary and they are of a specific usage. Managerial analysis. Often, even if you have got a system that is well written, on the face of it meets the customer needs, sometimes it will fail simply because management don't use it or understand it. So therefore, when you go through this kind of review, it's very important that the managerial analysis, who does it, do they get it, do they use it, is shown to be true. Do they follow the process? Do they focus on the right areas? Do they ask the right questions? And do they make timely, informed decisions? Baseline change control and change management. Baseline change control is all about the rules of engagement, how you control the work, how you set it out in the first place, and you change it through controls downstream, the do's and don'ts in essence. And of course, the change management is the documentation that follows along the way. Lastly in here is risk. Risk management, you will undoubtedly have a system that covers that, but this talks of how that risk management system in its own right sits within the system stated capability that you've got along the way, and that forces its interaction from the point of enabling the baseline and taking it right through to reporting and how the EAC and management reserve figures reconcile at the end. The very last one is behavior. Well, this is all about teaming, training, support, tools. The review, whilst going through all of the above, will look at explicits. It will also look behind the scenes. It will take into account, are people really working together? Do they share the same values and understandings? And this point should not be underestimated as being important in the whole scope of the review. Onto the process. There are 4 blocks: plan, review, report, and close. In the plan, you're looking at document and advise the process. You're looking at enabling the qualified expertise, the team, if you like, and assign responsibilities to this review. This will cover things like organization, budgeting, scheduling, risk, etc. You'll discuss and agree the SDR timetable. This will include the pre-review, the review itself, and the needs of the review after the actions have been enabled. Before all of that, you will agree what they call a data call list. This is a list of documentation that the review team will need at least 1 month ahead of time, such that they can review not just the process, but also the data that's come from the pilot project. For this reason, you're going to need to run the pilot project for no less than 3 months to get some trending. That initial data trace will occur. There will be identifications of those to be interviewed. As I mentioned before, they could come from program managers, CAMs, analysts, PMO, management, commercial finance leads, and maybe 1 or 2 other areas as well. You need to clarify the expectations and the assumptions of the review, make sure everybody's on the same page. And lastly, somewhat, it seems a bit silly, but the domestics. You're going to need the rooms, you're going to need the breakout rooms, the interview rooms, you're going to need the printers, etc., etc., etc. Don't underestimate that, because some reviews are held up simply because minor things like this have been somewhat overlooked. The planning stage usually for this type of review is 2 months ahead of the SDR, with the data call list items received at least 1 month ahead, as I previously said. The review itself consists of in-briefs, and this is normally 2, one from the review team lead and another from the project lead. And this is really designed to get everybody in that room a full understanding of what is going to be reviewed and how it's going to be reviewed and how the process will unfold. It will also remind everybody of the interviews, and it will bring up the detailed data traces, what's been found to date and the areas that are going to be looked at. And lastly, at the end of each of these review days, there's going to be an outbrief that will be cumulative as we go through the review, which is normally 5 days in duration on major large-scale projects, where these initial findings are laid bare to everybody. They won't have been written up yet formally, but at least it kind of sets the scene, and it maybe resets the focus for the following interviews over the following days. Once the review's been performed, then the report needs to be written. So the final report will include all of the corrective action reports. Those are named as CARs. Agreeing these actions is the need of the sponsor of those actions and the action owners to effectively shake a hand. This is the issue. Yes, I understand it. This is what we're going to do about it. And we will tentatively agree a timescale to complete. Then lastly is the closure itself. It is the sponsors of each of the corrective action reports that need to agree these closures. They will be fed information from the action owners, what's being done, how it's being done, what the outcome of those actions are showing. But as I say, the sponsors will need to formally close off these actions as being satisfied. Formal SDR closure requires an awful lot of communication, consistent and timely communication. The system is now agreed as being fit for purpose and can be contractually used in project or program management environment. And of course, this leads into the second of our authorization reviews, and that being the integrated baseline review. Scott, over to you.
Thank you, Martin. So as Martin said, we're going to move on to the integrated baseline review now. And Martin set an awful lot of background there deliberately because all the reviews are fairly similar in style and content. It's just what the focus might be. So we can move on a bit quicker from this point forwards. So you're joining us these 3 webinars because you've heard about EV. And if you've heard about EV, you've almost certainly heard about the integrated baseline review, or the IBR. It seems to be, and for some justification, the bit that scares people the most. You often hear people really worrying about IBRs, and in particular you hear people worrying about the implementation of EIA 748 when they're doing an IBR. Martin and I both experienced IBR chairman, and we've seen this firsthand an awful lot. Now that worry, to be absolutely honest, isn't without basis, isn't without reason. Martin used the word for an SDR of intrusive. An IBR is equally as intrusive. It is a forensic review of the project, and it is deliberately so. It needs to serve a purpose, and we'll get onto that now. So the purpose of an IBR, I'll read the top sentence out for you because it's really, really important. It's to achieve and maintain a project or program and customer understanding of the performance measurement baseline, its inherent risks, and the management control processes that will operate during the contract execution. There's 3 things I want to bring out there. Baseline. Is the baseline, does it cover the full scope? Is it realistic and appropriate? Does it make sense? Now, Martin said for an SDR, you will often have pure project management, project control specialists. For an IBR, you may wish to have in the review team people that understand much better the scope of work, because they're the sort of people that will understand whether a baseline does cover the full scope or is an appropriate style of baseline for that particular type of project. So the baseline, absolutely fundamental part, and it's to be an IBR. Let's be honest with this. Risks, key one with risks. Have they been appropriately identified? Are they being recorded? That's all good stuff. But in my own business, I do a lot of assurance. And one thing I always ask my teams is proof that they're not just admiring risks from one month to the next. How many times have we seen it when you go to a project and you ask them about the risk management process and they give you evidence of once a month, they get the risk register out, they look at it, they unpack it, they might adjust a few pieces of information, and then they put it away for the next month. What we're looking for here is evidence that risks are actually being actively managed. And that's really key to an IBR. And the final step I just wanted to raise here from this particular slide is control. You are looking for the project or the program to be demonstrably under control. And once again, that's appropriate control given the scale, the complexity, etc. of that particular project. The final point I want to raise before I move on to the next slide is Martin talked about the SDR being a pass-fail. The IBR is not. It is aimed at assuring that the baseline is robust and so on and such forth. However, does not mean the IBR cannot make some substantial recommendations. For example, it is not unusual for an IBR to turn around and say, actually guys, you really do need to replan a substantial part of your project. It is not going to work. It doesn't seem to be valid as a baseline. Even in the most extreme cases, an IBR can recommend termination of that particular project as it stands, and maybe a reformatting of the project, going forwards. So it doesn't, although it's not a pass-fail event, it can make some really substantial recommendations, but those recommendations are for the sponsors and the project manager to take on board to actually agree what they're going to do about it. So let's move on. When to conduct an IBR? We've already said an IBR is normally conducted only once. However, it can be enacted multiple times depending on what happens. If, for example, you have a significant change of scope comes in, you may wish to rebaseline and therefore to reconduct an IBR. It could be the case. It could be that, for example, you've had a significant performance deterioration, which means you go through that assurance loop, which means actually you've changed some of your system because the system wasn't working, and therefore it's best to IBR to get yourself back on a level playing field, to really assure yourself that the changes you've made will be effective. In any case, the first time you IBR on a project is a bit of a balancing act, especially for shorter projects. We normally say that the IBR should be conducted 3 to 6 reporting cycles from the start of a project. The reason for this is basically twofold. Martin's already mentioned trending data. That's very important, so we can start to get the feel of how the project is performing. But the other one is we need the systems to have bedded in. We need the data to be mature. So the IBR itself isn't making assertions based around false data. So it's really important. The reason why I say it's a bit of a balance, however, is we also say you should never conduct an IBR after about 10% of the duration. And the reason for that is simple. The DoD, the Defense Department in the USA, has done an awful lot of analysis because they've been running EV since about the 1960s, the late 60s. And they did a piece of analysis that basically proved, although I believe there's one exception now that proves this rule, that your performance is normalized by about the 10 to 20% mark, i.e., doesn't matter what you do, you won't improve performance after about the 10 to 20% mark of your project. So if you IBR after that, it doesn't matter what you do, the IBR will have no impact on the outcome. So there's a balance between IBRing early enough so you can affect the outcome of the project, and IBRing late enough so you've got really good, valid data on which to base the outcome of the IBR. So let's look at what we look at in an IBR, and you'll recognize this list straight away. It is exactly the same list as Martin showed you earlier, and that's absolutely deliberate. The only difference is with an IBR is where you put the focus of attention. In an IBR, for example, 80% of your attention is on schedule, organization, budgeting authorization, risk management, and behavior and general stuff. So 80% of your attention goes there. That is not quite 100% flipped, but it's a bit of a flip for the SDR. The SDR's more, less focus on each one. It's more of a blanket review. And that's really important to remember that the IBR is really focused on those things. It's not to say it doesn't look at those other items, but it's focused on that schedule. Do you have that valid baseline again? It's focused on those risks. Can you demonstrate you're managing your risks? And can you demonstrate this under control? So I just wanted to emphasize that. I'm not going to go into these in detail. Martin's already done that. The last point on this slide, of course, is, and we've mentioned this before, the IBR is about the project. So you do an SDR. Is my organization, does it have a system in place that can work? I then do an IBR on my project. Am I deploying the system that I have in place that's been assured on my project effectively? Do I have a good baseline, and do I understand my risk? So moving on, you'll also recognize a lot of this process. Now, the IBR process is very, very similar to the SDR. And in the same way, it starts about 2 months ahead of time, sometimes even more, depending on the scale of the project. And once again, I just want to get this message across. An IBR is intrusive. It will disrupt your planning, your day. There will be a lot of people involved. There's a lot of money involved in doing a full-blown IBR on a large project. We'll get into that in a bit more detail. So let's talk about the pre-IBR phase. Interesting enough, these slides I'm presenting to you now come from a presentation and a discussion forum that I do as a chairman of an IBR about 2 months before, where I talk to the project manager saying, if I am going to IBR you, this is the process we go through, this is the sort of thing I'm going to do, these are the sort of people I'll bring along with me. And it takes me 2 or 3 hours to do that. And you're going to get this in about probably 10 minutes. So excuse me if I run through this quickly, but I think what I wanted to make the point there is these slides are live slides that I actually use as an IBR chair, and they are really valid. They're very, very powerful slides. And if you wish, I can send you the full normal pack I use for teaching people about IBRs. So the pre-IBR, the key thing here is setting expectations. A lot of people, and I mentioned this earlier, don't really understand what an IBR is. So well before the IBR starts, there's a big job of making sure people understand what you're there to do, who's going to come along, why are you going to do it, all those sort of things in big picture terms. It's key thing here as well, IBRs are not boilerplate. An IBR is tailored depending on the size of the project, the scope of the project, the style of project, the company that may be involved. Is the customer going to get involved? Is the customer really ambivalent about it? So IBRs need to be tailored very specifically for every single one that's done. And you need to set those expectations right at the start. So having got those expectations set and got those big handfuls of objectives agreed, you then start to plan it. Martin's talked about things like handbooks and teams, etc. before, but I just want to talk a few things about IBRs that are specific. The handbook of an IBR is critical. It's the document that really spells out very clearly to everyone involved what's going to happen, when it's going to happen, who's going to be involved, how are they going to be involved, what to expect, how the IBR will be run, all of those things. It's really, really critical. And everyone involved in the IBR, whether you're the chairman, whether you're IBR team member, whether you're being interviewed, whether you're the project manager, whether you're finance, any other function, procurement function, you should have access to the handbook. So you have absolute confidence, you know why the IBR is going to have to take place and what your role in it is. The next thing I want to talk about here was team composition. IBR teams vary wildly. I've been in IBRs with teams as small as 6. Martin, for example, has been in IBRs with teams as large as 40 people, actually involved in the review, doing the reviewing. Those sort of style of IBRs with 40 people involved are more the US DoD ones, where the US DoD will pitch up mob-handed to do a review, and you can see why people are so scared of them. Generally speaking, in the UK, IBRs aren't quite as, shall we say, intrusive as that. We tend to make them more supportive than that particular methodology. But I just want to emphasize again, the IBR team composition in this review is often made up of project management specialists, could be finance specialists, but it could be the technical specialists as well in that field, so they can help point you in that direction. There's a few other things I was going to mention on this particular slide. Martin's already mentioned some of them before, but the IBR timetable is critical. Because it is intrusive, people need to understand exactly what they're doing and when. The IBR team will be taking time out of people's days during the review itself. So they need to know when they're going to be interviewed, for example, how much preparation they've got to do in advance, so on and such forth. And the last one, once again, I just want to emphasize this as well. Martin emphasized it, domestics. The domestics can make or break a good IBR. There's nothing worse, I would suggest, than making the chairman or the team of an IBR uncomfortable in their surroundings, making it difficult, their lives difficult for them to get stuff printed or to get from their room to the interview rooms or whatever. It's really important, and we often delegate a member of the organisation or project being IBR'd to have a focal point, and that person is a really, really important person who makes the IBR very smooth operation from beginning to end. Move on to the data trace. This is a unique one. You didn't see that in the SDR. The data trace is a deep and forensic review of the documentation of the project. So that includes, could include process, but it will include the PMB, it will include the risks, it will include the management information. And this happens round about a month before the project, that gives the review team a chance to analyze the outputs of the data trace and understand the project better before they go and review it, and understand maybe some particular areas of focus before they start the review itself. The IBR. So an IBR, even for a big project, is generally about a week, but it's a very, very intensive week. It will start with an in-brief, and that in-brief, as Martin's pointed out, they'll be split into 2, part of it given by the IBR chair and part of it given by the project manager. The IBR itself mainly consists of interviews, but it could consist of continuation of the data trace. So you've done your data trace, you get back into the organization with a team and you go, we found this in the data trace, please can you give us some more information, and we'll continue to trace that data through. But it's mainly interviews, and those interviews are mixed. You obviously need to interview the project manager and probably the project manager's project control experts. But a key one for the IBR is interviewing the CAMs, the control account managers. Are the CAMs consistently, coherently deploying the system that's been approved in the SDR? Do they all have a coherent baseline that adds together? Because you are looking for that coherency and consistency across the CAMs. But it's not just the project personnel like that. You may wish to talk to the engineers, you may wish to talk to finance, commercial, procurement, anyone who's involved in this project who has a part to play, and in particular, maybe is in an area of risk you wish to talk to. There is, for example, in the handbook, one of the things we do is actually we declare in advance the sort of things we're interested in. So we actually put example questions in the handbook so people can look at this. And actually one thing I didn't mention before is people often like to do mock IBRs before the formal team turns up. Two more things on this slide. Daily outbriefs, really, really important. The daily outbriefs are important because it's useful for the project manager to know what the team is thinking at the end of each day. So this is where we informally tell the project manager and their team what we found during the IBR. But another key point to this is the daily outbrief is really important because the IBR can't afford to have any misunderstandings that we carry through the actual review itself. So it's a good opportunity to say to the project manager, we in the IBR have found this. We're not too sure if it's correct or not. Can you help us out so we can then focus our following interviews the next day to make sure that we can either dispel what we found or validate it. Finally, the other thing I want to talk about, this is the outbrief. That is the first outbrief we have of the actual review. That then gets put into the actual IBR report, the final bit. And just one thing on the IBR report, because Martin's talked about reports before, is the report, for some IBR teams, they walk away going, here's the report, that's my job done. Martin and I advocate the concept of the IBR team can sponsor various recommendations in that report. And the reason why we do that is because the IBR team, the people that have made that recommendation, they understand why they made that recommendation and what the underpinning reason was. So if the IBR team can then sponsor the action, say, if you come to me, I can validate whether you've closed that recommendation or not. That's an unusual one, but Martin and I think it's a really good working practice. So that's a really quick hop, skip, and a jump through an IBR. I'm going to quickly go on now to surveillance reviews. Surveillance reviews, you remember, are basically throughout the project life to keep on assuring yourself. Now, we use the phrase here, keeping the pedal to the metal. What we're saying here is basically surveillance reviews help you keep that focus, do the right thing, do the right thing, do the right thing. Now, there's only one more thing I'm going to say about this slide, and it's really important. You will often see surveillance reviews held annually, often referred to as a mini IBR. Martin and I are going to advocate something different than that. We believe the best way is to take that list you saw earlier, organization, schedule, budgeting, authorization, and take an item risk-based, one a month, but have an annual cycle that you go through to make sure you cover the full scope each year. And do it, as I say, do it risk-based. So if you think scheduling is a particular risk, make sure you do scheduling either first or maybe even twice throughout the year. But the surveillance review covers the same scope as an SDR and an IBR. The key thing to a surveillance review, SDR though, last thing on this slide is Martin mentioned the cause for review. Because the surveillance review is the key point where you go around the axis over and over again, are we good enough? Are we good enough? That's the review that will start to get the trend analysis to define whether you are continually meeting the requirements of the system and continually performing as well as you should. It is the surveillance review ultimately that will say, hang on a sec, we have a worsening trend here. We think it's got to the point where we have a review for cause. And if you remember, the review for cause is, we highlighted it in red in the first box because it's something pretty nasty. You don't want to get there. And the surveillance review's job is to help people not get there. And the review for cause will almost certainly end up, because you will change the system or change something, going back into the loop and going, you need to do an SDR and possibly another IBR. So when to conduct a surveillance review? I mentioned before, it's continuous process now. So what Martin are advocating is basically start, and you even start before the IBR if you wish. Just get it going. Start to look at various points. Start to look at your scheduling. Start to look at your change control, risk management, etc. But make sure it is, say, risk focused. In other words, what are the risk areas of your system? And make sure that you plan it a year in advance. Because once again, these are reviews. They're going to be slightly intrusive. So make sure people understand what's happening and why and when. Surveillance review process. I'm not going to go into this in detail because you've seen this process before. You plan the review, you do the review, you pass out some actions and you close those actions. And that's a continuous loop. It's a plan, do, review loop. It's part of that fundamental nature of making sure we are continuing to do the right thing. So you'll see now a very common theme coming through. All these reviews are very similar. They cover similar ground. It's just what their purpose is that generally changes, and therefore what their focus is. I'm now going to move on to the final review, the annual estimate and complete review. Over to yourself, Martin.
Okay, we'll go through this quickly because I know time is short. However, it's labeled as an annual estimate at completion review. It doesn't mean to say that it has to be annual. You can do it 6 monthly, you can do it quarterly, whatever you like. But generally, on your big, expensive, high-risk projects where you will conduct this kind of model, you will want to do an estimate at completion review at least on an annual basis. This is irrespective of whether it's an earned value management system that you are deploying or a project control system. The review is aimed at looking at the project or program through, and this is the important bit, fresh, independent eyes. The need is to afford an opportunity to stand back and to look at the current performance and the risk and opportunities in order to judge the estimate to complete and the estimate at complete in terms of both cost and schedule. Typically, this review would challenge the project current ETC and EAC and management reserve predictions and advise reasons for necessary changes to the current reporting of performance and forecasting. Once again, the review team would comprise of both project management and engineering technical experts. You need to look at the technical work in detail. You need to look at history and performance gained from that history, and then to look forward to similar or same tasks to judge whether or not the same level of resource budget risks still exist or not, and look to make changes in your performance measurement baseline and or your forecasting downstream. Once again, the process is intentionally intrusive, and once again, it's not designed to be critical of individuals. The review usually performed jointly between the customer and contractor, and will require a mixture of specific project knowledge plus those invited technical and project management EVM suitably qualified experience people with expertise. Next slide, please, Scott. You'll see in the model it sits in the far right-hand side. It's as I say, it is an annual review usually, but it can vary according to need or to risk on a project or program. It's generally managed by exception and at the control account level. You don't need to look at every single WBS node. Look at the ones that are causing you the most grief. Normally, the ones by exception are identified having broken thresholds in their variance analysis. The review output would typically, but not limited to, include one, a reevaluation of the risk and opportunities. It will look at the reevaluation of future remaining tasks, especially those that are similar to ones already enacted. Here, the people conducting the review will look at what's gone on before and making a judgment on what's going to be planning to be executed in the future. Are there changes needed to be made? The third one, reevaluation of the funding availability versus the budget requirement. We keep mentioning this for good reason. Whether you're an SDR, whether you are in a IBR, whether you are in surveillance, or even this annual review, you always have to match the funding availability in terms of phasing and total to that of the budget requirement phasing in total. Updated change control schedules. You want to look at any changes that come from this kind of review will need to be qualified in terms of the explanation, and those changes that will be or being offered as evidence going forward need to be enacted and therefore change controlled and documented. Management reserve, you're going to find in this kind of review, not only will there be potentially changes to the baseline being argued, but also changes to the forecast. In terms of the baseline, then obviously that's going to affect your management reserve. And you're going to need to understand where you are at the beginning and what the effect of the changes that you're arguing as the point of this review, what changes to that management reserve will be downstream. The object of this, of course, is that you will get a better faith in the forecast in terms of the estimate to complete and the estimate at complete, along with an update to the management reserve burn down predictions. And of course, this burn down is an output of the remaining risks when they're going to happen and the value of those risks should they occur. And again, that can then be bounced back as a checks and balance against both the funding and budget requirement. And then number 7, the last one I've got here, is a real evaluation of the technical scope of work to be tackled. Collective decisions made via the review will provide an update to the schedules and the associated budget and resource needs. This may or may not affect the funding requirements, and this gives rise to a discussion between the project and its customer. I've already mentioned when we conduct it here, it really is up to you as project or program personnel leads, typically annually, but it can be held quarterly or 6 months along the way. Circumstances that lean towards increasing frequency will be high risk issues, excessive stakeholder focus, team turnover, scrap maturity, reported cost and schedule performance issues, and of course management reserve depletion issues. All of those things there will generally dictate to the frequency of this kind of review, notwithstanding that annually is a good benchmark to follow. One thing to note on here, as it says on the slide, similar in nature to IBR, the EAC review is intended as a deep dive and look at history as well as the future effort in order to provide a balanced view of reported performance and future outcome likelihood. I'm not going to dwell on this one too much. Similar type flow as in the others. You have a planning phase, a review phase, action phase, and a closure. And there will be sponsors and owners of any actions that come out of this kind of review, and of course that will feed into the either the baseline change control process or updated ETCs and EACs. That concludes the webinar. Back to you, Scott, and any questions that may come from the audience.
Thank you, Martin. For those that are counting, we're currently running at a schedule variance of minus about 7 and an SPI of just under 0.9. So Martin and I now need to write a variance report based around our performance today. Let me just roll out the questions. I'm going to throw this straight over to Martin. No, that's a bit unfair. Does Koppelman's 80-20 principle in EVM apply here?
So an earned value management system, by definition, generally means that you will comply to the 32 rules of engagement. They are explicit. Scott mentioned that each one is very detailed. It's not just a one-time, one bullet ask. There are many facets to each of the 32 criteria. So there is no 80-20 on that. In an earned value management system, by definition, is you will comply with all 32 criteria. That's the reason why we have mentioned in the same breath during these 3 webinars that the realization of a project control system. And the difference between the two is that a project control system, whilst it enables very similar requirements to set up and manage and use and report project or program data, a project control system is not nailed to those very, very explicit and somewhat difficult 32 criteria. So yes, whilst there is a level of tailoring that can go into a project control system, and whilst the project control system can enable earned value analysis just as well as a full-blown earned value management system description, you don't allow the tailoring will not be 80-20 in terms of its levels of compliance. It will be tailored in terms of the depth of each of the topics that will be required from both of these systems.
Excellent.
Hopefully
Thank
that
you,
answers
Martin.
the question.
Yeah, Good, thank you, Martin. I see here we've run out of time. We've got probably about 10 questions. What I suggest is that Martin and I provide a written response to these questions now that will be made available to you, because I said we've run out of time, unfortunately, but we will, I promise, we will answer your questions for you. So with that, can I just say thank you to everyone who's joined us over the series of these 3 webinars. It's been an absolute privilege and pleasure for Martin and I to have been able to do this. We've thoroughly enjoyed ourselves. So many thanks to you all. And I hope you've all learned something from spending some time with us.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye now.